I believe. Able to let him in.
You, but we'll let everyone in.
Have like Archie say something, so.
And our microphone might not be great.
Can you hear
so
me?
This is the microphone, isn't it?
This is the microphone now.
This is the microphone, Archie,
These
right there.
speakers aren't
And
working.
there's Bill Mary.
Can you hear me?
I'm gonna get an extension
Well, there's
cord,
Bill.
so
Yeah.
well, actually, I don't know now if I
Yeah.
can unplug it.
Yes, he does.
Cause it'll shut up.
I know it.
Let's see if Archie can speak again.
And wait, so if we use these microphones, it might actually pick up on here
Oh, these
better.
microphones do work?
They work, it's just not being picked up on Zoom, so
So
I
it might pick up.
better on there.
Yeah.
You're coming through loud and clear for what it's worth, so.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
All right, try
But
it,
I think
Archie.
if, Archie, can you speak into the microphone?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So we need our microphones on then.
Only when speaking.
Only when speaking?
Yeah,
Yes.
because of my feet off of that owl.
Okay, I'm going to get the meeting started and apologize to everyone. We were having some technical difficulties, but thank you everyone for joining. We are meeting today in a joint work session to discuss housing code updates, an audit and update. We were fortunate to receive grant funding through the Department of Land Conservation and Development and contract with Cascadia Partners, who are here today to present to you. The project that they're doing is sort of a two-part project. The first part is doing this housing code audit. The second part will be doing more of the updates. And I will pass it off to Rachel unless anyone has any questions. You all have her presentation in front of you as well as a memo regarding all of the information.
Okay, good afternoon. We'll just get right into it in the interest of time, but my name is Rachel Cotton. I'm a senior associate at Cascadia Partners. And as Dana mentioned, we're working with the city on this code audit and code amendment project that we will present today and hope to get some feedback from you on kind of our initial work. And then we'll talk about next steps. I'm joined today by my colleague, Jamin Kimmel. Jamin, if you want to briefly introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having us with you today, and we're looking forward to digging in. My name is Jamin Kimmel. I'm a partner with Cascadia Partners, and I'm helping to oversee this project as principal in charge of the project. We do a variety of these kinds of code audits and lead projects to update city zoning and development codes to help address your housing goals. So we've been doing this around the state here for a few years now, and yeah, we're looking forward to working with you all there in Bandon.
Okay, so a little bit about what we're hoping to cover with you today. We will review project background, and then I know you have the memorandum that we prepared regarding the code audit. We'll just do sort of a high-level overview of our findings from that code audit. And then we are hoping to have a discussion regarding housing-related issues and possible solutions, kind of a brainstorming session as we talk about barriers that we have identified to housing, and then just wanting to get a better sense of the local context, some of your concerns, some of your ideas. And then we'll do a review of where we are in the project and what comes next. So a little bit about the background. This is an effort to modernize Bandon's zoning and land use code with the goal of providing additional housing options, improving the affordability of housing, and reflecting community values. There are two pieces to the project. So there's a compliance piece. There have been a series of new rules and requirements that the state is basically wanting to make sure that codes across the state related to housing don't contain a number of things and do contain a number of things. So we've done what we call a legal compliance audit of the code, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the slides to follow. And then there's a big policy piece of this work. So we're really looking to understand ideas within the community to support housing and livability goals. So the way that I choose to think about this are there are some things that we will have to do as part of this work to get the city into legal compliance with some of these state rules and requirements. And then there are some things that it's more of a spectrum of what is the community interested in pursuing related to housing goals. A little bit about the context for this work. So we know that housing need is a bit of a work in progress in Bandon, but we understand that there are specialized dynamics in a small coastal community that is sort of a resort destination, but also a small town. And the need, especially for housing for the workforce, has been challenging. And so when we look at some of the data related to housing and look at a projection of need going forward into the future, we see that roughly a third of the need will be for housing like townhomes, plexes, and multi-unit housing with a fairly even split between ownership units and units for rent. So even though this data is a little bit fuzzy, we kind of have identified some generalized themes to inform the work. And when we look at the dynamics of the workforce and the housing market, we note that nearly 80% of jobs in Bandon are filled by workers living outside of the city. So we understand, Bandon Dunes is a big piece of this story, but not all of it. When we look at the leisure and hospitality industry and some of those jobs, we understand that often there's a mismatch between the types of housing and the levels of affordability that are available in the city and workers. So oftentimes folks are choosing to or forced to commute into town for local jobs. And that's just one piece of the puzzle. And I really want to just offer the disclaimer that we're hoping to have, we're just getting started with this conversation. We're hoping to hear from you and other groups as we do this work to help inform kind of the framework for those, the policy piece of the work. A little bit about the code audit. So this is essentially the content of the memo. We did a review for three things. We looked at those state rules and statutes and the legal compliance piece. There's also a requirement for what's called clear and objective standards for housing development in the interest of not causing unnecessary cost or delay. So for housing, there is a needed pathway that is clear and objective for all housing development. We also did an audit to look if that exists and where some of those barriers might be. And then overall, we did a scan for, as Jamin mentioned, we work on similar projects with communities across the state. And so we have sort of a list of best practices and code in terms of eliminating or lessening barriers to housing. We did an audit for those things as well. And I'm just going to do kind of a high-level overview of our findings and am able to answer questions about those things as well, if there are any. So for the legal compliance review, the memo really details this in depth. I'm just going to go through it in brief in the interest of time. But there are a few areas in the code where there are state statutes saying, cities must include these things or cannot include these things. And there are a few areas related to land use decisions, accessory dwelling units, and residential homes and facilities where the code is part of the way into compliance, and there are some amendments needed to achieve full compliance. There are also a number of areas we identified where the code does not comply with what the state statute requires. And so we've identified those as well. And as Dana mentioned, this is the first phase of work and it will be followed by code amendments to reconcile some of these conflicts. So we found occupancy limits, duplex allowances is kind of a specialized thing that I'll talk about next, manufactured home parks, occupancy of recreational vehicles, and single room occupancy. I'll just say, I think the memo does a nice job of unpacking all, all of these things in terms of what the requirement is and what the code in Bandon does or does not have. And so I will leave it at that for now, but happy to answer questions if there are any. Related to the duplexes, so this is one of the state statutes that says there are specialized requirements for what we call middle housing. And over the past few years, Oregon is requiring certain things of communities of specific sizes. Bandon is within the threshold of population, so it starts at a population of 2,500 and above, where the state's rules say duplexes must be allowed essentially under the same conditions as detached single-family housing. And so we've been working, you've likely seen parts of this work in progress, but we've been working with the staff to achieve compliance with these duplex related rules. And in brief, what that will entail are allowing duplexes to be an outright permitted use in the zones where detached single family residential is allowed, reducing the required lot size to match the same for single family in a handful of residential zones, updating design standards to be clear and objective. And then one of the requirements is no more than one parking space per unit in code. So that's another change that will need to be made. And the city is on track to implement these required changes on the timeline that the state has specified. So that's by June 30th of this year. And a little bit more about legal compliance. So there are a series of areas where it's not required to have these things in your code, but we think it's a good idea to do so. And so we've identified those. It's essentially if a person comes to do a development and they know legally the state says they can do these things, they can say, well, I know I can do that even if it's not in the code. But we think it's just an added layer of transparency and a good practice to have these things. So that's what we're identifying as codification recommended. And there are a number of those applying specifically to affordable housing. And so we've recommended those be included in the code. Again, this is optional, but I think as part of the conversation of the next phase of work, we can work through these things with the community and see, is this something that you want to do or think it's just okay to have it not included in the code, but our recommendation is to include it. I'm gonna pause there because that was a lot of content. And I just wanna check if anyone had any questions about the legal compliance aspect of the code audit.
I have a question, please.
Yes,
How does the state define middle housing?
that's a great question. So by the state definition, middle housing includes duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. And depending on the size of the city, there are different requirements for allowing those types of middle housing. So because of Bandon size, duplexes are the ones that are required to be allowed, and the other types of middle housing are not required. But as we'll get into later in the presentation, we think some of them could make sense and be fitting and a good idea for the community. Good question. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more question before
Yes.
we move forward, please.
Go ahead.
What is the state's current definition of affordable housing?
So affordable housing, if you're talking about the kind of these codification recommended, they have a threshold. I don't know it off the top of my head, but typically it's some percentage of units that are set aside affordable to 60% of median family income and a certain percentage affordable to 80% of median family income or some mix thereof. For all of these, there are some specific attachments to, deeded income restricted housing that we can get into in more detail if that's of interest. But good question too.
Rachel, can I just add something to that?
Yes.
A little nuance is important is, yeah, these, when we use the term affordable here, there's the generally accepted level of affordability is that a household doesn't spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And so if someone is living in one of these developments that took advantage of one of these zoning allowances, then there would be some kind of limitation on the income level of the person. So there would be income qualified housing in order to make sure that they're those units are being leased to households that are at an income level, certain income level or below, and reserved for them.
Okay, thank you. And the median family income, that is calculated for the city as opposed to the state or the county, is that correct?
It's typically would be the county because that's how the state calculates the different rent levels and affordability and provides grants and awards.
Great, thank you.
So the next area of focus for the code audit is regarding those clear and objective standards. So we tend to think of this as the ideal is if two different people looked at the code and these requirements, they would come to the same conclusion. They would interpret it the same way. If it's clear and objective, it's measurable. It's again, two people seeing it and making the same conclusion. If it's not, it's what's called discretionary, and the state does not allow that as the only pathway for housing development. So you can provide an alternative discretionary pathway, but you must also provide a clear and objective pathway. So we found some areas in Bandon's code where either definitions weren't included, conditional uses are not considered clear and objective. So something needs to either be allowed outright or not allowed, but it can't be allowed conditionally because that's discretionary. And then again, kind of some of the design standards we've been working with staff on providing. We know those apply to all types of housing, which is okay, but they also, everything in the list needs to be clear and objective to be allowed. So that was the clear and objective scan. And then
Rachel,
additionally, as
before we
I,
get into, sorry to
oh
interrupt
yes,
you.
go ahead.
Yeah, I look like maybe a couple of questions. So it's hard for us to tell if there are people trying to chime in with questions before we move on. So please do speak up if you want us to come back to any of the content on the legal compliance or legal clear and objective standards.
Can you hear us? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so
Okay, let's talk occupancy of recreational vehicles, where it says it does not comply. We just did that not too long ago, didn't we? Allow
Yes, we
people to
did.
stay in RVs. So what exactly does not comply with that? Are we gonna have RVs parked everywhere around here now, or what?
No, so the state rule requires that if within RV parks and manufactured home parks, that if they are hooked up to utilities, they are allowed. I'm just gonna pull up the exactly what our findings are to make sure that we're providing correct information. So let's,
Rachel, I have it up here.
okay, thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, so this requirement actually only applies to RVs that are sited in a recreational vehicle park, an RV park, or a manufactured home park. And yeah, if they're connected to water and sewer and electricity, meeting the city's standards to make sure those are lawful connections, then there can't be an occupancy limit on how long someone can live in that RV. And so we found that it was not clear in the code that RVs were permitted to be occupied long term in manufactured home park. And or nor in an RV park. There may be other cases where your code has allowed for people to live in an RV long term, and that can be a useful allowance in your code to make that clear that's permitted. It's just that this specific statute applies to those RV parks and manufactured home parks.
I can just clarify that the city council passed a resolution to allow folks to live in an RV in the backyard of an existing dwelling, but it's a temporary measure, so we never codified it. It was just by
And they
resolution.
couldn't be hooked up to utilities either.
Not without permission from the Public Works Department.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's just sort of like a slightly different scenario that they're talking about, that this would be in a manufactured home park or in a recreational vehicle park, that we just need to make it explicitly clear. There's no time limit for how long they can.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other?
So under clear and objective standards, an example you used in your report here, you were commenting on pergolas and bay windows. And and current municipal code just basically states a bay window. You're saying clear and objective standards, if I understand you correctly, you have to have dimensions of the bay window, is that correct? To make it clear?
Yes, typically that's the best practice. So you would say a bay window of at least this width and height, right? And so you're providing kind of parameters for what either both a definition if it's not something that's readily understood, and then also clear dimensions for what qualifies.
That's big.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can understand why that may seem overly onerous or make the code overly complex. But I can tell you from the perspective of working with a lot of planning staff and also talking to a lot of housing developers and home builders around the state, is that they really actually appreciate when those things are well spelled out in the code. That way there's no guesswork about whether or not, is this bay window big enough to count as a bay window? Is it a bay window? Is it just a window that projects a little bit out of the house? Right. So that kind of specificity just helps to remove that need to sort of negotiate or to have disagreement about whether or not the applicant is meeting the standard. So it does make the code a little bit more complex. I would say one thing that we can do if there's concern about the code being too complex or too prescriptive, right? Saying you must have a bay window that's at least this dimension, but someone wants to propose a bay window that's not that dimension, is that you can always have alternative options, right? You have one standard that is clear and objective, and that may be very specific. But you can have another one that says you can propose something else that meets the same intent of this standard, and the planning commission could approve that, for example. So there is ways to create some flexibility, even though it seems like a very rigid standard.
And I would say the way the city is implementing its design standards, you provide a variety of options, and that's good. We tend to see in certain codes where it's unclear how many of these things are expected and what combination. So like Jamin said, you can think about the end goal, what's the intent of these requirements, and then kind of work through the clear and objective pathway to make it very clear, okay, check, 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 it did all of these things, but then also potentially another option for people that may have a different idea of what they want to do. I'm going to keep us moving just in the interest of time. So the third piece of our code audit was an identification of what we call barriers to housing. And these are things that we commonly see in code where, if the intent, as we mentioned, kind of the guiding principles for this project are to provide additional options, increase housing affordability, and to align policy with sort of livability and housing related goals and banded. So these are kind of some common things that we see in code. And then we will work with the community to identify some potential solutions. And I'll just kind of work through them because we have slides on each. So use regulations that are too restrictive in commercial and residential zones. And in this case, when we look at the idea of providing additional options, more cost-effective housing types, we really turn to middle housing and we think about, okay, in some residential areas, it may be appropriate to allow a wider spectrum of options in ways that are compatible with kind of the surrounding neighborhood and surrounding uses. So we've identified some opportunities for that in many of the residential and certain commercial zones. And then cottage clusters are another example, a middle housing type that may make sense. It's currently not defined or allowed in Bandon's code, but it could be another option as far as a housing type. If you don't allow them, there's kind of no way to build them. Another barrier is just not allowing density at a level that achieves some of these additional housing types, mainly that middle housing spectrum. And Bandon density tends to be limited by high minimum lot size requirements. So most of the zones do not have a maximum density standard. But for example, in Bandon, in certain zones, the requirement, if you build one unit, is 5,400 square feet of land. If you want to build an additional unit, 9,000 square feet. That will go away. The duplex requirement will go away under those changes we mentioned. But in general, if you're requiring more and more land for additional units of housing, the numbers don't make sense, particularly in a coastal community where the price of land is very high. And so oftentimes, even if you were to allow these types of housing, if these minimum lot size requirements are not aligned with kind of the numbers of development in terms of the costs and the return, it still remains infeasible to develop these types of housing. And when we think back again to kind of the housing needs for different members of the community, for workers, for retirees looking to age in place, for extended families as just some examples, we really want to assure that there's a spectrum of housing types and opportunities that are available within the community. So minimum lot sizes are one way to do that. And another important piece of this is if you think about all of your other development standards, so maximum height, lot coverage, setbacks, those things tend to remain as is, even if you change the minimum lot size. So you might see, for example, 2 units that are taking up the same, what we call like a building envelope on the lot. They might be, the 2 units might each be smaller than if one house was built on that same lot, but in general, it has kind of a compatibility with the existing fabric of the neighborhood.
Rachel, can I add one quick thing before you
Yes.
move on there? Yeah, just on density and minimum lot size. Another way to think about this is, you think about a home builder or a developer that's proposing a housing project, and they have the site they've acquired, right? And if their options are building, let's say, 3 single-family homes, or 8 units spread across 2 quadplexes on that same lot, they will look at that option. Given those 2 options, they will be given a pathway in order to build what would be more likely smaller units if they built the 2 quadplexes, let's say. And also, those units have the potential to be more affordable. They're not guaranteed to necessarily be more affordable. But because you're taking that same lot and you're spreading that fixed cost of land across more units, it makes it more feasible for that developer to provide those units at a lower price point. So what increasing the maximum density provides is that option for the economics of housing development to make sense for building slightly more affordable units. And so that's sort of the math behind why this sometimes makes sense. It's the ability to spread out the fixed cost of development, land, infrastructure, et cetera, over more units. So we could talk more about that as we get into some maybe specific proposals we would have in the future meetings. I just wanted to offer that idea as a way to understand that relationship between density and potential housing affordability.
Do we know what other coastal cities have as minimum lot size for a single family dwelling? Do we have, or what the state considers a minimum lot size for a single family dwelling?
It really depends on the zone, but for reference, we're working right now in Tillamook County, so Rockaway Beach, Nehalem. We're working in Yachats. We're working with Lincoln City. So we are attuned to, you know, kind of what I would call peer cities to Bandon and what we're doing. And as we get further into the work, we're happy to share kind of what are other cities doing about these things. In the case of Tillamook County, interestingly, they opted into the statewide middle housing requirements. So these cities, even smaller than Bandon, are now needing to allow the spectrum of middle housing within their cities, and they're updating their codes with our assistance to do that. So yes, we can absolutely provide some comparable examples. You know, different zones have different levels of intensity, and we can continue to honor that, but there are ways to include additional opportunities for these types of housing. And that's, I think, will be part of the work that we do with you.
Thank you.
And then just to conclude, off-street parking requirements. So we understand the reality of a rural coastal community is there is not a lot of opportunity for transit. Most areas of town are not so walkable. So there's limited applicability to reducing parking requirements, but there are some best practices. And we find that in communities where the market demands more, it will supply more, but there are some best practices related to not kind of over parking your property, particularly for multiple unit developments. Just providing a little bit more flexibility there often means you might get 1 or 2 more units out of a project rather than forcing a certain amount of parking. And that can make a big difference. So again, if anyone has questions on those barriers, we're really wanting to open this up. I know we're a little bit behind on our time, but I really wanted to open it up to have a conversation with you all about, you know, your experiences with housing related issues for you and your neighbors and community members. And then kind of your ideas, hearing those barriers. Do you feel like we're missing anything? Do you feel like we're getting anything wrong? And finally, what are some ideas and things you think the city can do to help meet housing needs? So I just wanted to spend a few minutes hearing from folks about your ideas and just kind of anything you think we should be tracking as we continue to unpack some of these policy options for Bandon.
One quick amendment to that. We're here to help you with your zoning and development code. There are many other things the city could do outside of your purview of the zoning and development code. And so we're glad to help talk about some of those ideas. We work on other kinds of policies related to housing. But if you have any specific ideas related to the way the city regulates housing through the zoning code or the subdivision ordinance, et cetera, I think we'd be most interested in talking about that.
Yeah, I would say it would be interesting to know are you familiar with the Dormy housing project with the city and the school district?
Yes.
I would be interested to know how that development frame could be shortened, if it could be. So I think we're running at about 2 years, and I'm not sure exactly where they are in the process. And maybe that's normal for a project this complex, but I think it'd be interesting to know, is there anything in the code that's keeping that from moving more quickly forward?
If I could respond, that's, I believe, a question for city staff. The workforce housing project is nearing its final conceptual design phase. There was issues with the original project architect Despite our best effort to work with the developer's architect for several months, we felt like it was necessary to look at alternatives. And with that, we encouraged the developer to partner with another entity that had more specific direct experience in the type of housing we were looking for. So upon bringing on this new component of the team, we have made significant progress in trying to get a concept that, again, is very unique. It would be contingent upon adopting a new specific plan type of zoning that would allow for a combination of single-family detached townhome product and an apartment complex within one development in an effort to maximize its development potential. So the project delays weren't necessarily because of the zoning. They had more to do with the inexperience of the developer and the original team that was assembled, that we had to delicately encourage that it be revamped to bring in the appropriate team so that we can make significant progress. So we're at the phase where upon receipt of the final conceptual plan, the team will assemble, determine which is the preferred alternative. And upon making that determination, we would then have a joint meeting of the council and the school board to unveil the concept before it's released to the community. But that is really the reason for the delays. They weren't expected, and they weren't a result of the planning or entitlement review process. It had more to do with that inexperience of the developer at the time.
Great, thank you, Tori.
That's helpful context for us. And I'm not overly familiar with the kind of zoning allowances or any of those details, but I wanted to point out one of the legal compliance pieces that may not have been an exact fit for this project, but could certainly be applied to similar projects is the single room occupancy allowance. So the state requires cities to include a definition for single room occupancy, just meaning no fewer than 4 attached units that can be independently rented, and provide living and sleeping space, but they can share, food preparation and sanitary facilities. So most folks, I think, are familiar with the definition of SROs, but similar to a dorm. And then they must be allowed in zones allowing single family or multifamily dwellings. So that could be an additional piece of if in the future such projects there's interest in doing them, you would have that directly in your code, and that's required by the state. Other ideas? I just want to do a time check too. Are we still trying to end at 2:30, or do we have a little bit more time?
I think we have more time since we were delayed.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Because I want to make sure to give this, appropriate time and space for folks to process and share ideas. I don't want to rush through it. We're just trying to work with our technical hiccup that we had. Anyone
I think it would
else?
be interesting to know of the approximately 1,200 people that commute into Bandon for work. It would be interesting, if possible, to know why is that? I'm sure a large component of it is housing availability, but I'm thinking some of it could also be personal preference as far as where they want to live. But I think that would be kind of interesting. I'm not sure where the 1,200 comes from and what sort of data underlies it, but obviously you can't interview every one of those people and determine what it is.
I'd like to say something. I think it's clear that our ordinances have led to the kind of housing that we see today, which is very limited in the middle class, middle housing, I guess you call it. And I'm so happy. I'm not always happy with consultants, but I want to say that the memorandum that you put together is excellent. And it shows if we truly want to follow what the state is telling us, that we want housing here that's not just high-end single family. We have to do these things even if they're not required by law. We need to make every effort to encourage housing, and it's just getting worse and worse here and not better.
I agree with what you guys, I agree with what you put forward to us. It's excellent. And I'm on the same bandwagon as Mary. We're not real happy with consultants, so you guys did a great job. Thank you.
Yep.
The only thing I could add is that in my practical experience, I've written codes 30 years of my life with a background in architecture. With that, it's almost impossible to establish development code regulations or design standards that don't allow for some flexibility. So in light of the bay window description, you know, there has to be some allowances that provide an alternative approach to obtaining the approvals that are just beyond, you know, establishing the minimum design standards. Because we all know that the massing of a building is very different. So the scale of a bay window on a single family detached home that's 1 story in height could be very different than one found on a much larger residence. So from an architectural and design standpoint, there has to be the ability to accommodate those potential adjustments and scale for the appropriateness of the application for these elements.
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And we, as part of our work, will sort of think about certain policies in a spectrum, you know, starting with, do you want to allow this something that's optional in these and then like the next part of the question would be, in which places would you want to allow that? And the follow-up question might be, and how do you want that to look? And so as part of this process, we call that kind of a code concept. So as we refine the code concept through those 3 at least pieces of the conversation, we'll get additional input on things like massing, on things like garage and driveway appearances, because you're correct. If you have something on one unit, it has a limited impact, you know, and you do have design standards that apply. But as you kind of not necessarily copy and paste, but as you replicate that across a site on multiple units, you could have unintended consequences of those original design standards if you're not thoughtful about how they should apply. So we're certainly tracking that, and that won't be part of the ongoing conversation. Other folks have thoughts, ideas, things for us to know. We've met separately with staff, so we're attuned to some of the issues that have come up, the Dormy project being one example, thinking through, you know, your seasonal workforce, you know, how much higher demands kind of in the summer and fall season rather than the winter, that sort of thing. So are there other things you want us to be attuned to as we're thinking through some policy options?
You were gonna say something, Dana. What were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna ask a question about something else, but I didn't wanna hop in if you had thoughts about any of those things.
I have one additional question or comment. Oftentimes when the state establishes regulations that are mandated to local municipalities, you know, these design standards or requirements that are currently being looked at and incorporated for consideration in our municipal code, they will likely change in the future and they will consistently change. The problem with Bandon is that we don't have the resources to continually make these changes and make the required updates. Are there, or is there the ability to adopt any reference to state codes so that that would help us avoid having to do comprehensive amendments like we're entertaining today?
Yeah, I could take that, Rachel. We've gotten a question a couple of times recently as well. Yeah, and I think in some cases, there is the option to simply reference a state statute in your code, and then as that statute, if that statute changes in the future, then your code would remain clear in your code that that's still required even if the specifics of the statute change. We're in a legislative session right now, and some of the things that we're presenting to you have the potential to change a little bit, even as a result of bills that are in session today. And so we're tracking that, and we're going to adjust course a little bit if anything comes out of that session. So I think that is an option. I think there's a balance there we want to strike with. Sometimes it's helpful to have what the specific allowance is codified, in your local code, so that people who are less familiar with the looking up a statute and figuring out what's allowed would not have to go and do that. And so there's cases where it may not be necessary to do that because the type of developer who's going to use this statute, for example, the affordable housing allowances or something that may not be super important for you to have codified in your code, because anyone who's doing that type of affordable housing development is probably a professional nonprofit affordable housing developer who knows that those statutes exist and know how to access them. So there's a balance there, and we can try to strike that for you all to make sure the code is stays current over time. I will say there is a little bit more funding available now from the state to keep your code updated over time. Over the last 2 legislative sessions, that there's been more funding allocated to local jurisdictions to update their codes and keep them current. So that may be available in the future.
Okay, I just have a quick question about, does every city have design standards, or are there places where cities have removed them altogether?
Many cities don't, especially smaller cities. It's a question of often administrative. Part of it is kind of community sentiment, right? I live in Newport as an example, and there are districts in Newport, Nye Beach being one of them, where there's like, you go there, there's a very obvious look and feel. You can think about other coastal communities, Bandon being one, but also Manzanita, Cannon Beach. You can see the design standards as you're kind of going around town. And yes, it's typically a question of is that what the community value is, to maintain a certain look and feel, or is there a desire for more flexibility, less administrative kind of oversight of those types of things? So good question. We work in communities where they've said, no, we don't want design standards. We don't feel like that's fitting. We kind of like that everybody does as they do. That's part of the fabric of this community. So it's really like place specific, I would say, in my experience. Often bigger cities tend to have them, specifically in certain districts that they're wanting to maintain an identity for.
Thanks. I would just add, as the planner in the office, it can be really challenging sometimes to review these design standards. And we frequently tell people that it doesn't necessarily get you a great looking house either. You can't really regulate good design through static, clear and objective standards. And so this is, I'll put in a plug that the City Council is having a public hearing on June 9th to discuss those duplex housing code amendments. And one of the components is the design standards. So you can see what the Planning Commission came up with, and then there's opportunity to modify those further. Or I think we can talk again with Cascadia to see if there's an option to maybe revamp them altogether. We just kind of fixed what already existed.
Yeah.
So put a plug for that. Thanks.
Right, it could be part of a larger conversation where they maybe make sense in certain districts or areas that have, a visible kind of cohesive identity that you're trying to either preserve or and continue, or they may, like Dana is identifying, often when there's limited staff capacity, having one additional thing to make sure every development is doing is an additional kind of potential time delay on development. Other thoughts?
So I have a question about specialty housing. So the state of Oregon has, in the last 20 years, really made a push to move clients out of institutions, whether it be state hospitals due to mental illness or other institutions because of developmental disabilities. historically, communities have been very sensitive about having these sorts of programs cited in their communities. And historically, city councils have had the ability to put the kibosh on certain citing of these specialty programs. And I'm wondering if you view our current circumstances as making it easier to cite these programs in communities and in neighborhoods, or no difference?
So,
Rachel, could you go back to the slide on residential homes and facilities?
right,
I'm
I
not sure
was-
if that has the part of it there. So just to connect the dots here, I believe many of the kinds of facilities you're referring to would either be classified under the statute as a residential home, which is usually a smaller group home with a certain number of individuals that may need assistance as well as living in the home. And then there are residential facilities, which are larger facilities. And the 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 statutory requirement there is essentially that in every home, in every zone district where the city allows for a single family dwelling, they must allow at least a residential home. And in every zone district where the city allows for a multifamily dwelling, they must allow for a residential facility. So these things are sort of equivalent to the intensity of an apartment building is not as sort of an equivalent intensity as a residential facility, right? So this part of the statute hasn't changed recently, but I did think we found some ways in which the city's code is not entirely in compliance. So that's why you see it saying partially compliant with that requirement. And I'm trying to recall exactly what was out of compliance. Rachel, do you recall that here?
So we, in some cases, either a residential, mainly a residential facility would be a conditional use. So that is, again, that discretionary pathway where you're not saying you can do that. You're saying, okay, you might have to go through a hearing process and introduce all these other things. So yeah, the state requirements are for a, that it would be allowed in, like Jamin said, for the larger ones, zones that allow multifamily dwellings, and then for the smaller ones, so caring for 5 or fewer individuals is how the definitions are broken up. Anywhere that allows single family dwellings. So parts of the code are in compliance, and there are a few things that need to be changed for full compliance. Good question.
Did that answer your question? Just want to make sure.
I had a question on, there was a comment about allowing ADUs for single-family dwellings that are now authorized vacation rentals in the city. I presume that means that the code could clarify that if you have a vacation rental dwelling in a single-family home and you add an ADU, that ADU cannot then become a vacation rental dwelling also. Is that correct?
So there are 2 parts of that. ADUs must be allowed on any lot where a single family home is allowed. So that's the first piece of compliance.
Mhm.
And furthermore, they cannot have occupancy requirements. So you can't say it can't be a short-term rental. And you can't say it must be a short-term rental. You would regulate your short-term rentals separately. So if you say have a cap on the short-term rentals, there can only be this many, or they must be spaced in this way, the ADU would fall under that separate regulatory climate rather than being regulated as part of like the outright ADU allowance. A little bit convoluted, but does that answer your question?
Yes and no, but isn't the whole purpose of an ADU to provide housing? So why would you allow an ADU to be a short-term rental or a vacation rental dwelling?
You can't.
I do believe that you could, if you have short-term rental or vacation rental regulations, that you can, we maybe need to double
Okay.
check this, but I do believe you can
You could-
apply those to, you have broad discretion as a city
Okay.
Right, you
to
can
regulate
exclude
short-term
them.
rentals, yeah.
Okay.
It just, you couldn't, so for example, in this case, you couldn't stop the ADU from being constructed,
Constructed.
right? But you could, I believe, regulate that they can't be used as a short-term rental. If it,
Okay.
as long as it's consistent, as long as it's, you're treating it similarly as you do other homes
Okay,
and,
great.
you know, in that area. But in terms of, you know, this is about the land development code, so you know, and ADUs, the part of the idea behind this is that, that ADU, even though it might be constructed and initially to be a vacation rental, the idea is that if it's on the market, then maybe it won't be a vacation rental at some point, and it could convert into a permanent or a long-term dwelling at some point in the future.
Or
That's all.
that's somebody owns a, you know, short-term rental and they decide they want to build an ADU and rent that out, you know, on a long-term basis. Or live there and rent out the primary dwelling, short-term. So there, it just provides more options. Like you're saying, it's additional housing unit.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna move us to our project schedule and next steps, to give you a
We
sense
have,
of.
we have a couple of
Oh,
questions.
more questions?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We can talk offline, because our code does have quite a few provisions about, vacation rentals and when you can have one, that I feel like are in conflict with what you just said. So I think there's some more maybe discussion we have to have, and then I can report back to the council and the planning commission about how this might apply to us.
Yes, let us, I know it's complex when you have separate, like Jamin was saying, the zoning code would apply to the, are ADUs even allowed to be built there? And that's a change, but then how you regulate them as short-term rentals is a separate thing that you're identifying. So it does get complicated. Any other questions?
I have a question about the specialty programs. So
We can't hear this.
You can't?
what,
Talk right into your
Can you, you can't hear him?
can you hear me now?
Yes.
So, under the Oregon statutes speak to specialty programs, they sort of categorize them as 5 beds or less, which works well in most communities, 10 beds or less, or 16 beds or less. So the 16-bed units are considered facilities, the others are considered residential homes. So I'm wondering if, say, a 16-bed residential treatment facility could be sited using a boarding house model pretty much anywhere in the community, or if
No.
you would envision there being some restrictions on that. Thank you.
I think the key difference there would be whether treatment and care, there are the services provided on site there. And so if there are services provided on site, then that use would be classified as a residential facility. If someone was proposed that, that's how the city, the planner there would classify that use, and then it would be subject to some of those limitations. If there is no treatment or care provided on site, then yes, it could be classified as a boarding house, or potentially a single room occupancy development. But those that would be just in the case where the residents are living there, they're not receiving any services. Does that make sense?
That wasn't.
Yes, thank you.
So did Gordon's question was, could that be built anywhere in the city where homes were allowed? A 16-unit facility?
Well, I think, so you were talking about like a residential, and I don't know the definition off the top of my head, but I know that a residential care facility is defined differently than a residential care home. And I do think of the one that we approved on Fillmore, 2018, does that sound about right? I don't know how many rooms that was, but I do know that and Rachel or Jamin hop in. I think that the way it's defined is based on the number of beds, so if it's a certain number and smaller, it's a home, if it's a certain number and bigger, it's a facility, and there are state laws about where we can or where we have to allow those types of things.
Yes, but I thought they said that it had to be a zone where duplexes or larger were allowed
Multifamily.
before you would have to have a facility with 16-bed facility.
Well, the code changes that we're making, that we are required to by state law, say anywhere you allow a single family dwelling, you also have to allow a duplex. So there's a lot of requirements that if you allow one type of housing, you have to allow other types of housing. But again, Rachel and Jamin have in if I am incorrect here.
Oh, I can do
Yeah.
CC.
Maybe I can try to sort it out. It does get tricky. So a residential care facility, I believe, is any facility that has 6 to 16 beds in it, and where there are people living there and there are services provided on site. Those facilities must be permitted where the city allows for multifamily dwellings. Your code today defines multifamily dwelling as any dwelling with 3 or more units on the same lot. So that is actually exclusive of a duplex. So if you allow single family houses and duplexes, you don't necessarily then need to allow residential facilities.
But if we still live
The
with,
city has some room to define multifamily dwelling. And so what many cities have done as they've allowed more units on the same plot of land. So maybe we're going to allow triplexes and quadplexes where we allow single family dwellings. And then multifamily dwelling is redefined as 5 or more units on the same lot, right? So yeah, there is some flexibility there to how you define a multifamily dwelling, but the requirement that residential facilities must be permitted in the same districts as multifamily dwellings is required by law.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
And as we get into the code amendments work, we will untangle some of these kind of, if this changes, this must change in this way. That's part of the work that we'll do with you, just to be clear about that. Some things are sort of a question mark at the moment of how will they look in the future, and other things will be adjusted accordingly. Any other questions folks have? Okay,
Just
I
one
want,
parting thought, Rachel, I want to give
Okay.
everyone here. I know we had a little bit of discussion about design standards. And I think we're glad to help you work through if there's some changes you want to make to your design standards. But and when we talk about barriers to housing production or to providing more affordable units, I would actually say when we talk to developers, design standards are a pretty minor thing. Those don't really get in the way much. They are sometimes difficult for staff to administer. But I'd say when we're talking about code concepts and other things the city could do to create more opportunities for different kinds of housing or more affordable housing, things like maximum density or the minimum parking requirements.
yeah, that's gonna be,
Those things, those are the effect, how many units you can have on a plot of land, how big the building can be. Those are the things that really are more impactful on whether or not housing gets produced. So just wanted to offer that, it could be easy to get caught up in how big a bay window is here, right? But there's some important decisions about how intensely do you want to allow development in a way that's consistent with your goals as a community for character and livability and everything like that, but also maybe providing some more housing options.
Okay, and finally, just want to kind of orient us in terms of where we are in the project. So we have been, the work that we're reviewing with you today is our code audit. And we're here talking with you in May. As mentioned, there's been an advisory committee formed for this project. We're hoping to meet with them. It's looking like in early June to try to get additional input and feedback on some of these ideas. The next phase of work will be kind of taking this conversation, those barriers that we've identified, and coming up with code concepts. And so we will be meeting again with this group probably toward the end of the summer, early fall, to talk through the code concepts. We will also be working with the city to have what we're calling community feedback sessions. So someone earlier made the point of, let's try to understand why are people who aren't working or who are working in Bandon not living there. And, that's one example of something we could potentially do some targeted outreach, questionnaire, survey type of thing, or just activity to try to get more input on that. And then to try to, in general, understand people's concerns, their experiences, and their ideas as part of that community feedback. We will fine tune those code concepts, and then they turn into code amendments. So the things that you're wanting to move forward with as a community, we have those package of things. The legal compliance piece will be things that must change, as well as the clear and objective standards. We'll kind of work those into amendments, but then those code concepts, things like allowing middle housing, which types of middle housing might you want to allow? Where might you want to allow them? How should it look? That might be an example of something that goes from the code concept to the amendments. So we're hoping to work with the community throughout this year on kind of getting to those amendments and adopting them. Any questions about the timeline or next steps? Okay, well, thanks so much. We navigated this little technical hiccup, no problem, and really appreciate everyone's attention and good questions. And stay tuned on our next meeting. I think will likely be early fall, but also the community listening sessions.
Thanks, Rachel and Jamin. Good to see you.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you very
thank you so much.
Thank you.